if we really take a step back, if we just take one step back, the thing that we are now coddling and patting us on the head about and protecting us from is that a lady in the group said salmon. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Uncovery podcast. My name is Maddie and I'm in recovery from anorexia, and I talk about it on this podcast. I recorded an intro to this episode and it was so long that it's now going to be its own episode, but that means that there's no real intro to do for this one, except for the fact that it is snowing outside and it's October. So we'll be moving from iced coffee to hot coffee, and I don't have winter tires on, which is a rookie move because I've lived here in Calgary my entire life. So I should know better than to cross the threshold from September to October without winter tires. But I digress. Today, we are going to talk about group therapy. And I've done quite a bit of group therapy since, 2016 was probably the first time that I ever did a group, on and off. Obviously, there was a pretty substantial break when I was in London. I tried to do a couple of drop-ins there, but at that time, which I'll probably have to do an episode about, my eating disorder was just out of control. So I wasn't doing a lot of group or therapy. And when I wasn't doing it well. So I took a big break then. COVID was obviously a bit of a disaster. Some of it went on to Zoom. None of it felt really impactful, which I'll talk about. But I've done quite a bit of group therapy, and I'm not sure if it's super different between eating disorders and other types of group therapy. I'm assuming there would be some big differences, but I'm going to first start out with a story which makes a point I think is important about group. Names are going to be changed. Dates are going to be anonymous, like when this was, where this was, with what program, who was it, just because it's not a necessarily complimentary story about the experience of it. So everything has been changed in terms of the details. Let's just say that. So what you need to know for background is that this particular group had a lot of rules. And I'd been to a group from this same provider before this, and they talk about these rules. And there are all these rules that boil down to basically, you can't really talk about food or eating or symptoms or eating disorder behaviors you're struggling with, because we don't want to, wait for it, and you've listened to episode 3 perhaps, you'll know my thoughts on this. We don't want to trigger anyone. And in fairness, the comparison game in group therapy is strong, right? Especially when you're in your early days and you've never been to group before and you're looking around and you're like, am I the thinnest? Am I the fattest? Am I this? Am I that? What's everybody else like? And you're so pent up in anxiety, and you're probably susceptible to triggering things. But as you might know if you've listened before, and if you haven't, I don't really believe in a lot of trigger warnings. I don't think they're necessarily helpful. If anything, I think people seek them out to be triggered. And I think it doesn't teach us as people with eating disorders in recovery to stand on our own 2 feet and to navigate the world, because the world will not accommodate every single thing that triggers you. So that's aside. My first question as I sat there at the time was, isn't this an eating disorder group? As in, shouldn't we be able to talk about eating disorders? Why else would we be here? But in certain groups, we talk about skills instead, and these are essentially coping mechanisms and tools to put in your toolbox, and there are lots of worksheets and acronyms, and it's supposed to tell us how to live in the real world while coping with our eating disorder, but without really ever talking about our eating disorder. So in this particular group session, we had been reviewing some homework, I think, from the week before, and we were invited to share the skills that we had, sort of worked on the week before. And so someone went first, and we're just going to call her Megan. And Megan was sharing that she had been working on her nutrition and taking her medications, which are two of these like good things that set you up for success. Fantastic. Now, Megan said that she had been focusing on, wait for it, superfoods. And as soon as the word was said, I knew exactly what was about to happen. I was like, oh, Megan, oh, you know not what you have just done. Because I can hear the word superfoods, and I know that she means well, right? She means that she was eating things that were supposed to be really good for her. Now, what I know about, diet culture and the eating disorder world, how superfoods aren't a real thing, and that it really is just like a label that you put on things that are nutrient dense in order to sell them more. They're not really a real thing, but people can get very, very fixated on them. Now, immediately the facilitator is like, I'm just gonna like stop you there. Stops Megan from speaking and sharing the rest of her share. And it's like, I'm just gonna, let's just maybe not say the word superfoods. And if we could just say, oh, you worked on your nutrition. And Megan is totally confused. And I'm kind of getting the feeling that maybe Megan hasn't done a lot of therapy or groups in the past or something like that, where she just maybe doesn't know what she is and isn't allowed to say in an eating disorder group. And she's confused. She's like, oh, okay. And the facilitator's like, we just want to really make this like a safe space for everyone. We really just want to make sure that nobody's like triggered by what we're talking about. And we're on video, so I'm trying to control my face, but I'm like, oh no, not this. Because there's something very patronizing and infantilizing about being told that you can't handle listening to other people talk about things that are really quite everyday. And I know where this is going. So we need to create a safe space. Megan's very confused. Megan's like, I was just telling you kind of what my experience was. And to her credit, Megan is giving some pushback to be like, look, I was just sharing what I was doing. And she kind of continues and she's like, I started also taking vitamin C because I heard, and she gets stopped again, shut down. It's like, let's just like not talk about like the details of what it is that you were taking, because it could be like super triggering for people. And Megan is now at a loss. Megan is like, okay. And I feel terrible, because it's really hard sometimes to share what you're going through in a group. It's generally a pretty vulnerable position to be in, to share with people what you're going through. It's kind of the point of group, is to be able to go through those things together and work on them. But now being shut down, I can see her kind of pain and confusion. And she's like, look, I was focusing, I was eating on things that felt good to me. I was having salmon. And she's like, nope. Facilitator's like, She's like, we really need to make sure that like this is a very safe space and that like people are not triggered by this, blah, 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 blah. So Megan's like, okay, well, I don't really feel like I can share now. So she now feels a little bit like activated and like that she's being shut down and she's confused, and she kind of like goes on mute. So then the facilitator is like, okay, this is like, okay. So like, understand this might be very like stressful. Like, does anybody else want to like kind of share what they're like feeling about this? And so much of me was like, shut up, Maddie, 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 shut up. And I was like, me. Because I was like, I can't like leave her out there floundering when I just feel how I feel and that this is ridiculous. So anyways, I put up my hand and I'm like, okay. And I say this gently because I don't want to get in trouble and I don't want everybody to think that I'm a bitch, but I'm like, this is kind of an issue that I've had in certain groups where we aren't allowed to actually talk about the things that we're going through in our eating disorder because we're all afraid that we're going to get in trouble for being triggering when this is an eating disorder group. And I've struggled with this before where I'm really not sure what I am and I'm not allowed to share. And making practical use of the tools that we're actually being taught is going to be mighty difficult out in the real world if we're not able to talk about them in this kind of quote unquote safe space. There are no trigger warnings out in the real world. There are people that are going to be talking about their juice cleanses and their superfoods and their this and their that and their exercise regime that they do 3 hours a day. Like, these are things that are going to happen to us. And so I've always kind of struggled with not being able to talk about things that we're struggling with in group. It feels difficult. So my my expectation, of course, is this like round of applause from all of the other group members that are like, yeah, we agree. We just want to be free to talk about what we're going through. And instead, it is crickets. Crickets, not a peep from anybody else. And I'm like, oh no, it is me and Megan out here on this like island. And I feel like, oh gosh, everybody thinks I'm a bitch. Everybody thinks like, so I get into my head and I'm like, okay, well, that's all. That was my share. So I'm done. And Megan, she comes kind of back on and she's like, I feel really bad. I feel like I really didn't mean to do anything. And now I feel like I've hurt people. And like, I don't really know why like superfoods or whatever would be like so triggering. And this other lady comes off mute, pipes in. She's like, because of people like me. She said, because people like me got into this mess because of superfoods. And so I'm like, okay. This is going off the rails, but fair enough, right? Like this is what we should be able to talk about, is saying like, okay, because you got so fixated on quote unquote healthy food, you now feel super triggered by people that mention salmon or mention superfoods. Fair enough. But also, how are we going to accommodate every single person's very individual triggers? That's just me in my head. So she kind of lashes out. And then this other person comes on and is like, it would be great if the facilitators could kind of like get control of the conversation. And I'm like, this is now a clown show. This is now completely out of control. I thought this was going to be a really nice, like rip the Band-Aid off, kind of like have a nice, vulnerable and authentic conversation about some of this stuff. I was wrong. I was wrong because then for the rest of the group, all it was, oh, we are so happy that all of you have stayed. We know how difficult this conversation was, and it's really such a testament that you've stayed with it. And I'm like, okay, if we really take a step back, if we just take one step back, the thing that we are now coddling and patting us on the head about and protecting us from is that a lady in the group said salmon and said vitamin C. What are we doing here? This was my feeling. And like, I totally understand that there could be very, very different perspectives on this. I understand the importance of keeping people feeling safe in a group setting and not triggering people. I totally understand that. But to what end are we doing this? Where now these skills are meant to be used in the real world. Like what do we think is going to happen when we get out of this group? And now nobody's monitoring our environment at every moment. We're going to have to do this stuff in the real world. So that's a short version of that story, which isn't very short, but here are kind of some of my thoughts, right? It was such a missed opportunity to actually dispel the myth of superfoods. So this person obviously hasn't taken on board sort of debunking the diet culture silliness, right? There's no such thing as superfoods, blah, 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 blah. Reading health advice on the internet will not help you, generally speaking, especially if somebody is selling you something. Foods are compounds made up of nutrients in various proportions, and that is it. Some have a lot of nutrients, some have less nutrients, some have certain body benefits. Sure, this can all be true, but superfoods are basically a sham, period. But knowing that and acknowledging that somebody might be triggered or activated in some way by the mention of them, the thing that we did was it was shut down. The conversation was shut down instead of using it as an opportunity to say, oh, interesting, Megan, you mentioned superfoods. Let's unpack that a little bit. Like let's look at what we mean by that. And maybe let's talk about the fact that there really isn't such thing. And it's something that diet culture really teaches us. Everybody learns. Everybody is safe from their triggers, and we dispel the myth and we actually can move forward. Then she might understand that this label of good or bad or super, kind of got us into this mess. Everybody is sort of facilitated. And so I really saw it as such a missed opportunity because you end up making everybody feel unheard, unseen, etc. The other thing that came to mind for me was maybe if something like that would be really derailing to you, maybe you're not ready for group therapy yet. maybe I don't know if this is a controversial opinion or not, but like maybe there's a certain amount of individual therapy one needs to do before you're ready to be in a group setting and have other people talking about their experiences. Maybe groups should have like levels. Do you know what I mean? Like there's like kind of like a beginner entry into eating disorder recovery, potentially more at risk people psychologically, mentally, physically, however. And then there's sort of, as you're walking through the process, there's different groups so that people that are in there you can relate to a little bit more. They're a little bit more on the same level. Maybe we should ask people what they're triggered by or if they're triggered by, because everybody's triggers are completely different. Some of them are completely nonsensical. So in order to accommodate every single person's potential trigger in a group, it means you can't talk about anything, right? Maybe feeling constrained in sharing information is triggering to me. Maybe being treated like a child that's getting patted on the head for sitting through a very, very difficult conversation, maybe that's triggering to me. Maybe that's frustrating to me. But if we just say that, oh well, everything is triggering and so we're going to talk about nothing, it's like, what are we doing here? I think maybe it's the patronizing part that got me the most, is that it's like, if you're talking to a room of adults, treat them as such. I know that we eating disorders, poor little fragile eating disorder people. Actually, we're quite capable. We're actually quite capable, and maybe you should treat us like we are. Anyway, two things can be true. We can be mindful to not be unhelpful in discussion of things like weight, numbers, explicit details, like the gory details of eating disorder behaviors. We do not need to discuss those. I understand that. But saying like, here's what I've been working on, or here's what I've been struggling with this week. Like if we're not able to talk about that, then kind of, what's the point? Now, I don't want to feel like I've been like ragging on group therapy in general. This was, one event on one day in one particular group, right? Like, so I'm not trying to paint a picture like this is how group therapy is. There's a ton of different experiences that I've had, and most of them, the majority of them, have been very positive, right? And the one that I'm in right now, I'm really, really happy in it. The thing about being in group, and what I've noticed now recently, is that it brings up a lot of different stuff depending on where you are in recovery. So like I said before, early days, that comparison game, that sort of absolute fear about what are they going to make me do? What am I going to have to talk about? That's rampant. When you're actually into recovery and you're doing it for real, then it's less performative and it's more, I dare to say triggering. But it is like going into a haunted house and all of the ghosts are you. So around every corner, with all of these different people that have similar but different experiences, they're all a reflection, I'm finding, of some part of me or my eating disorder. And sometimes that is infuriating, right? So if somebody's like kind of bouncing into group and is like so excited to be there and they're just excited and chit-chatty and they know all the answers, and I'm like, and I'm so not having it. That's a mirror. I have been that person. That ghost is me from another time at another place. Or another person that's like, well, I can't make change and I feel like I'm so stuck and I want to do it, but I just feel like I can't. And I'm like, well, that ghost is also me. I have sat in that chair and I have been doing that exact thing and not really making change and not really moving forward. Or somebody being so early to it that they're like, I have only just admitted to myself that I have this. I haven't even, told my husband or something like that. I'm like, damn, the fact that you even made it to a group before being out about it, also impressive. Not something I ever did, but this idea of like real secrecy, like that ghost is also me. So you're navigating all of these conversations and you're seeing all of these reflections of yourself and your experience in all of these other people. And it is so, so powerful and it's so valuable. And it's also so uncomfortable. And the one that I think now really, really gets me when I'm in a group is when I'm in a group with somebody that's, decades older than me and still struggling so hard. And that's like, ghost of the future, where I'm like, if I start to slip and I let any of this go, that will be me. And I can't let that happen. I cannot let that happen. So it can be very motivating in that way, where I'm like, I have to avoid that future. I mean, at the same time, the first time I ever stepped into group and people would say like, oh yeah, I've had my eating disorder for 10 years or I've had my eating disorder for 16 years. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I could never, like that is such a long, fast forward, we're like, we're 12 years in and it's like, okay, well, it is what it is. These things that you never thought you would be, or the things that you never thought you would go through, and the time that passes that you never thought that you would lose. If you do not make the change, it's absolutely going to be you. So you end up being that person in the group being like, I've been here since 2016. And that's okay, because if you're doing it for real, there's a very different energy to it. Being in group performatively and answering the questions and nodding your head is an extremely, extremely different experience than being there and knowing that you have been working your ass off all week to not relapse and showing up anyway to potentially some very bouncy, excited early recovery people and being like, oh my God, you're all me. All of these ghosts are me. So I want to say that there are some pros and some cons of group therapy. And obviously the pros, people have been through it. They can provide a lot of insight and tips of what got them through certain things. If they're further along in recovery, they can provide some insight of getting over those hurdles. If they're earlier in recovery, there's some things that they're learning that maybe you forgot from back then, right? These like revolutionary reminders. Being able to communicate is a lot less isolating. We go about our lives with maybe not that many other people that we know that have or have had eating disorders. It's a weird thing to say lucky, because it's not, lucky that other people have had to go through this, but I'm very lucky to have, some very close people that actually do have experience having had an eating disorder. And that's so, so incredibly valuable, but it's something that group really provides because it's such an isolating illness. If it's online, it is readily available. There is that benefit where you can just have easy access to online groups. Some of them are free. Some of them are just very, very affordable, depending on where you can get them from, compared to things like individual therapy, which can be very expensive. So there is that. Some of them are casual. A lot of them really, most of them, pretty much all of them are very, very strict about anonymity, which is why I've changed all of the details of the stories that I tell, or mix them all up into sort of, a different one that takes pieces from different things, because you can feel a bit safer if you know that you are anonymous in a group. There is a belonging and a togetherness that ends up happening in really good groups and well-run groups, where there's almost a camaraderie and a sort of like you're cheering each other on. When someone shares a story and you're like, thank you for sharing that. That was incredibly difficult and incredibly powerful. There's something there. There's this one girl in my group, and she's always the one that's the first to like give people tissues when they're getting upset. She's always the first one, just jumps into the middle circle, grabs that tissue box and offers a tissue. And I just love her for this. Every single time it happens, I'm like, yes, there's, it's this, it could be a really, really beautiful thing when it's done well. Full recoverers are invaluable if those people are in the group. And so maybe they're kind of in maintenance phase, and maybe they don't often go to group, but they kind of do certain groups when they just need a little bit of a zhuzh up in their recovery. 'Cause they can really say like, I've been there and here's how it went for me and here's why I continue to do it. That's something that's really powerful. Now the cons And this is kind of, it depends on the group again, right? Like some people will respond better to like very structured kind of homeworky type groups. Some people will really respond well to a more of an unstructured type of format where it's just kind of shooting the shit and whatever comes up, comes up. But a really good facilitator will be able to sort of bridge between those two things. Obviously, it could be triggering because if you are at a place that certain things impact you very significantly, there's a risk that someone's going to say something in group that you're like, oh man. Or like someone brings a Diet Coke and you're like, oh, I'm trying to get over my whole diet pop thing. And this is, man, do I wish I just had a Diet Coke. But it's completely an individual experience. And that's why I think it's so difficult to be like, well, you can't make eating disorder groups not triggering. The whole damn point is to be triggered and get over it. That's a whole point, and to get help. Like I said before, people that are at very different levels of recovery, I kind of struggle here where it feels less relatable in some regards to be at very different places of like stages of change, for example, if you've ever heard of that, where you're kind of, it's like pre-contemplation, like you're not even planning on making change. Contemplation, you're thinking you probably need to change something, and then you move into sort of action and maintenance. And if people are in very different places, like not willing to make change versus very much in it and looking for support in doing it, sometimes I find that tricky. Sometimes I find it tricky with people that are coming in at different levels, or people that don't have the experience in therapy that others do. And then, you kind of have to start from the basics. Not that that's bad to have a review of the basics from time to time, but a little bit difficult. If you have a group facilitator that is patronizing, like I mentioned in the story, that it feels like you are in grade 1 and you're being talked to by a teacher, I think it's not helpful, or it's certainly not helpful to me. I kind of like to be leveled with. I like to be talked to like a person. So that's something that I struggle with, at least. If you get fixated on the comparison game or the who's the winner of the eating disorder game, groups will not be a good time, because you will spend the entire time just analyzing where everybody's at, what everyone's doing, and then comparing your own behaviors accordingly. So like I said, I think that there needs to be a certain level that you kind of get to before an eating disorder group to kind of avoid some of the negative impacts that could happen. I also think on the sort of Zoom versus in real life, there is an energy about having everybody in a room that you cannot match. I think this about work. I think this about all kinds of different things, that like Zoom, it was a great tool for when we needed it. And, to kind of fill in the gaps where people maybe can't access an in-person group. Absolutely. It's better than nothing. But there is something about being in person in a group that you can't recreate that any other way. A lot of it really does come down to the facilitation. You have to have somebody who can hold space, direct conversation, ask good questions, be kind. It's an art, I think, to facilitate a group. So people that do that and do it well, it is truly a marvel to watch you at work. And so I think that's probably, all that I wanted to say. I don't want this to come across as some kind of big rant against group therapy or certain group therapy or anything like that, because I think it can be an incredibly powerful thing to integrate into the other eating disorder supports that a person has. I don't think it's enough on its own, certainly not. It can be a gateway into somebody going in saying, okay, well, at least I've acknowledged this problem, but maybe now I'll be more open to going into therapy. For me, this actually kind of happened when I got back from London and I was just not in a good spot. And I went to group and I was just kind of like, oh, okay, I'll go back to group, blah, blah, blah. Because I was too ashamed to go back to my therapist. I was too scared to go back and show her how much I had failed at recovery when I was away. And so instead I just went back to group. And that was when my therapist, who was the facilitator, basically like approached me after and was like, are you seeing any therapy right now, Maddie? Are you doing any one-to-one therapy? And I was like, no, I'm afraid because I have been struggling. She's like, okay, well, maybe we should book an appointment. And I was like, okay. And that's how I got back into therapy. So it was by going back to group first. But yeah, however you get all of your supports in place, I don't know that the order of it really matters all that much. And I would also like to say that I probably have a different perspective or a more intense perspective on some of this stuff, just because I've been through this so long and I don't feel fragile in the same ways that I used to. So I try to put myself kind of, when I was at that place, where would I have been? And that helps me to really access a deeper level of empathy for people where they are. Just because I feel like I've been around the block and I've seen a lot of different groups. And so I hope that this is helpful, or at least kind of, shares an experience of what to expect if you kind of go into a group therapy situation. It's genuinely, on the whole, way more pros than cons, I think. And if you're really doing the work between groups and on the outside of those actual sessions, it's a really nice and validating and foundational support to have kind of in your repertoire. So yeah, that's the episode. I hope that you have a wonderful week and that you don't have to dig your car out of a snowbank if you're in Calgary. I might. Yeah, take care. Let me know if you have any thoughts in my DMs or in the comments on the Instagram post, or you can send me a note on the website. Let me know if any of this resonated. If any of y'all have crazy group stories. I've got more than just the one that I shared today, but we will leave that for another time.